Hello there, Romans here, and welcome to another installment in my Worst to Best series, where I take a discography of a certain group and I rank all of their studio albums going from worst to best based on my own personal opinion. I also review all the albums from a viewpoint of a musician, as I am a singer, songwriter and a bass player for my own group Jakobe, and in April we have released our debut album called Pursuits in Life, and what makes the album unique is that it's a pretty heavy prog rock without guitars. Instead you have drums, bass, saxophone and keyboards. You can check out the first single, We're Building Our Monument, on my YouTube channel, but also a new single, A Way to Oppose, which is a studio live. And in the description of the both videos you will find all the information about where is the record available. It's available on all digital platforms like Spotify, Tidal, Deezer, iTunes, Amazon, but also in this digipack version of a CD with a very beautifully illustrated 20 pages long booklet. And today I'm going to rank all the studio albums from Queensryche.
Music review. Music review.
Unlike some of the other bands in my Worst to Best series like Toto or Europe, Queensryche don't really have such a well-balanced discography. What it means is that Queensryche are responsible for some of the best albums I've ever heard, but some of the records I couldn't care less about. Let's not talk about history or anything. I will mention a few important facts or things throughout this video. So I will rank all of their 14 studio albums. So let's start. At number 14 I have Q2K from 1999. This record came as probably the biggest challenge a band had to sort of go through at that time, because prior to making this record their lead guitar player and principal songwriter Chris DeGarmo left the group. So the band was suddenly left without a musician who wrote like, I don't know, 85 to 90% of their music, and quite logically they decided to continue and go on without him. And well, this was a test that they failed quite badly. This is a very tiring album to listen to. It's absolutely forgettable. I've listened to it like, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, and I've listened to it also prior to making this video for like, I don't know, 6-7 times. Quite honestly, with the exception of a song One Life, I can't remember any of the songs. One Life is kinda okay, maybe Beside You is okay, but that's it. Very, very forgettable record, so let's move on. At number 13 I have Dedicated to Chaos from 2011. This was the third album in a row where the lead singer Geoff Tate was pretty much in charge of the creative output of the band, for better or worse, or in this case for worse. And this record, pretty much with the two preceding records and the one that came after it, was essentially Geoff Tate's solo album. He also relied on external songwriters, just like with the two previous albums, and most of the band members were excluded from the songwriting process. So that's, I think, the main reason why this doesn't really feel like a Queensryche album. I think that the actual sonic and stylistic premise behind the record was kind of interesting. He said that he wanted to focus more on the rhythm section of the band, so that's why drums and bass are more up front as opposed to the guitars. But the record doesn't really work. It's pretty much as forgettable as Q2K. I mean, like for example, Get Started is a simple alternative rock song that sounds just like anything from Q2K. Then Hotspot Junkie maybe has some Queensryche flavor, but for example the third track, Got It Bad, is a really horrible song, and especially those backing vocals, they don't help either, and every time you hear these backing vocals on the records, it's not good. Probably the only good track on the album is Retail Therapy, which is kinda enjoyable. Also, I like the track Broken, which is a bonus track for the deluxe version, and also the track Higher with the saxophone. These two tracks kinda work, and maybe if the whole record was like these two tracks it would have worked, but otherwise this is a very forgettable record. At number 12 I have Frequency Unknown from 2013. But first, a little bit of historical background. So in 2013 we actually got 2 albums from Queensryche, but both of these albums were recorded by different bands. So how is that possible? The lead singer Geoff Tate was fired from the band because there were long-term conflicts between him and the rest of the band, and you know, him being in charge of the previous 3 albums, all of which were quite heavily criticized and not very good, didn't help either. So he was fired from the band, and he hired new musicians and he decided to use the name Queensryche, and he released the album Frequency Unknown. There's also the rest of the band, and they hired a new singer and they also released the record under the name of Queensryche. Then they went to court, and fortunately the court decided that the rest of the band can keep the name Queensryche, which was a very good decision, and Geoff Tate had to eventually rename his band, so he renamed it as Operation Mindcrime, after one of the most successful albums from Queensryche. But Frequency Unknown is really an album that shouldn't have been released under the Queensryche label or moniker, because it is not a Queensryche album. It is essentially Geoff Tate's solo album. It's a very faceless rock album that, quite honestly, if it wasn't released by Queensryche, and maybe if Geoff Tate didn't sing there, nobody would give a shit about it. Some of the songs are okay, like Coal and Slave, but for example the track Dare sounds just like the previous album dedicated to Chaos, but with more guitars up front. And everything is just very cliche and predictable. Plus, if you look at the cover, you see F, Queensryche, U. So this was like the message from Geoff Tate to his ex-band members, and it's just so childish. I mean, come on, Jeff, what are you, like 15? At number 11 I have American Soldier from 2009. So this was the second album with the lead singer Geoff Tate being sort of like the leader of the band. And I think that the actual concept behind the record is pretty good. He decided to interview a lot of American soldiers and he recorded interviews with them. And he used many bits and pieces of those interviews on this record. And even though I think that the actual concept is really interesting and worth working on, there are songs where music sort of feels just like some background noise or maybe soundtrack for a movie. Songs like Silver, Unafraid, If I Were a King or Remember Me. You have these bits and pieces of those interviews and you find yourself being focused more on what the soldiers are talking about rather than the music in it. And you know, at the end of the day you're just kind of left wondering what were the melodies. You know, you can't really remember it. Dead Man's World is one of the best tracks on the album. It has that sort of a Queensryche vibe, but there are 3 tracks in the middle of the record: Dead Man's World, The Killer and Middle of Hell, all 3 of which has some sort of a saxophone at the end. 2 of the tracks have, I think, a saxophone outro and 1 song has a saxophone solo, and this fact makes all 3 songs almost undistinguishable. Man Down is kinda okay track, also Home Again. It's a kinda cliche song, but in a good way. It's a duet between Geoff Tate and his daughter, whose voice sometimes seems too auto-tuned, sometimes not at all, giving it a very sort of a plastic feeling. But I mean, the sentiment is kinda nice. So I would say American Soldier is not necessarily a horrible album. It is kind of okay, and if you are patient enough and you're willing to dig deep, you will find some meat on this record. But fortunately, or unfortunately for me, I'm not that patient, so I guess this is just one of those records that I will probably never listen again. Number 10, Here in the New Frontier from 1997. So this was the last album recorded in the original lineup of Queensryche that was responsible for their best work and for some of the best albums I've ever heard. And this was the first album where they started losing it. The previous album, Promised Land, was the first album where Queensryche really re-established themselves in terms of sound and style. And this record saw them continuing that sort of an alternative way. And at times it feels like an alternative rock with almost like Beatles-esque harmonies and melodies, but quite honestly I don't really think it works in many of the songs. Like for example You, Hero, Miles Away, and even the first single, Sign of the Times. These songs just simply don't really work for me. Get Alive is kinda cool, the voice inside has an interesting mood, Saved sounds just like Promised Land Leftover. And the best track on the album for me is Anytime, Anywhere. I love that heavy riff. If the whole record was written like this, I think it would have been a fantastic album, but unfortunately it's not. This is also one of the records I'm probably never going to listen to again. It's kind of funny because the first time I listened to this record some years ago, I actually liked it, but now when I return to it, I just, you know, it doesn't work for me. And I think that's the reason why Chris DeGarmo essentially decided to leave the band, because he probably realized that, okay, that's it, I've got nothing else left to say, so let's become Pilot. Yeah, that's true, he's actually a pilot. But with this record I can at least appreciate the band for experimenting a little bit and trying out something new. Number 9, Operation Mindcrime II from 2006. Okay, so based on the previous 3 albums, Queensryche were going through a bit of a identity crisis. They were getting less and less popular, and at that point they kind of didn't know what to do next, so the singer Geoff Tate came up with an idea to create a sequel to one of their most successful and most celebrated records, Operation Mindcrime. This is kind of similar to, for example, Halloween and their Keeper of the Seven Keys, the Legacy record. So at this point it seemed only logical that the band would kind of like revisit one of their most successful records. It's kind of funny because the singer Geoff Tate came up with this idea, but the rest of the band were not really that happy. But this record actually was pretty successful and it put Queensryche back on the map. They became a household name again. They had a pretty impressive tour for this album, where they performed both of these records in their entirety, which was pretty impressive considering that Geoff had to sing for like 2 hours every night. Yeah, and many people would probably ask, would this record be as successful as it was if it wasn't called Operation Mindcrime II? Well, I guess not. Also, a lot of people said that nobody asked for a sequel, and yes, that's true, but the point is that this record put Queensryche back on the map. It was both a good and a bad thing for the band, because the previous 3 albums were making Queensryche less and less popular, but at least it was a collaborative effort. This album was pretty much in the hands of Geoff Tate, and once this record became popular, I think that he realized that, okay, if I'm in charge, the band is going to be successful. And that's why the band released some of the worst material with him calling the shots. Okay, but about the album, I actually think this is not such a bad album. Sometimes it tries too hard to sound like Operation Mindcrime 1, for example the song The Hands, but are there really any other records that sound like Operation Mindcrime 1? I guess no. And Rearrange You is, for example, one of the best tracks on the album. Also, you have Pamela Moore reprising her role as Sister Mary. You have Ronnie James Dio as, I think, Dr. X. And yeah, I think generally this is a pretty solid album. For me, it kind of loses a bit of a focus towards the end. There are maybe 2 or 3 tracks that I would probably delete from the track list. At number 8, I have Queensryche's self-titled album from 2013. So this was the second album that was released in 2013 under the Queensryche's name, but this was the real Queensryche. We had the whole band with a different singer, Todd La Torre, and I think that this is a pretty solid album. It sounds a lot like Queensryche did in the late 80s, and there are really great songs like Spore or A World Without, but also this record is not perfect. For example, Redemption or Vindication, both of these tracks have that sort of a trademark 80s metal a la Queensryche, but I think that the choruses of both tracks are way too commercial, and sometimes this album left me hungry for Queensryche being more heavy and more metal. But this is definitely a pretty solid album. Number 7, Tribe from 2003. I know that this may come as a surprise to many fans because Tribe is not generally considered to be a very good album from Queensryche, but I actually think it's very good. This was the album where they seemed to be embracing new metal, and it's very dark and heavy album, but it's very Queensryche at the same time. There are no guitar solos, and this record actually seems like a continuation of The Promised Land. I mean, if somebody told me that this record was released after The Promised Land, I would have believed him. This record also saw the return of Chris DeGarmo, the principal songwriter of the band, who was more like a guest on this album, but he co-wrote 5 of the tracks, and I think that this is generally a very good album. I mean, Open is a great track, Desert Dance is phenomenal, Tribe is also good, also Blood. So yeah, I think this is a great album. Number 6, Condition Human from 2015. So this is what I would call a late career jam. This is a really good album, and I think that this record is an improvement in every way as opposed to the previous self-titled album. And I have listened to this album only prior to making this video. I kind of missed it when it came out, and I was just left wondering, like, why haven't I listened to it when it came out? This is really very good album. The songwriting is very solid from start to finish. For example, I-9 is a very cool track. Just Us is a sort of a ballad. It's very artistic but also very atypical. My personal favorite track, if there is one, would be the title track Condition Human. That really sounds like from the Operation Mindcrime, and I just wish Queensryche will get more progressive in future because they really have potential to do that, and I really love them in those longer tracks. Okay, number 5, Promised Land from 1994. So yeah, this is fantastic album. So from now on, the remaining 5 records are pretty much an essential listen for all of you. Promised Land was, as I've already said, the first time they really re-established themselves in terms of sound and music, and it's a record that has a very oriental, desert-like vibe. For example, the track I Am I, also Damaged, but it has a very catchy alternative rock chorus. Out of Mind is a beautiful artistic piece on acoustic guitars. Then Promised Land is this epic song, and that saxophone is fantastic. Also guitar sounds are great. One More Time is almost heartbreaking. Also Someone Else is one of the most emotional ballads I've ever heard. So Promised Land is a beautiful record. I think it's the most progressive Queensryche have ever been up until that point. Number 4, Queensryche's debut EP and The Warning from 1983 and 1994 respectively. I know that these are 2 separate releases, but I tend to listen to them together because they sort of like represent the starting point of Queensryche. These records made Queensryche a very unique 80s metal band because they were much more technical than pretty much any other band around. And they also had very unique singer, Geoff Tate. I mean, there were quite a lot of singers at that time in metal who were singing high notes like Bruce Dickinson or Rob Halford. But I think Geoff Tate was doing it in a way like no one else. Very clean, pristine vocals, and yeah, it's amazing. I love the EP. Queen of the Reich is pretty much an epic metal track. Also, Lady Wore Black is phenomenal. I love that track. And the actual Warning album is also great. The title track is very interesting, but the chorus makes it very unpredictable and very distinguishable from all the other metal bands. Then, for example, Deliverance is great. NM156 is a metal anthem. It's a really great track. Take Hold of the Flame is another classic. Roads to Madness is this long, progressive 9-minute song. So yeah, this is a great album. Maybe Promised Land in terms of songwriting is better, more advanced, but it's that soft spot for 80s metal that made this record number 4, or these 2 releases. Number 3, Empire from 1990. So Empire is the most commercially successful album of Queensryche, and this is actually when they become the most successful they've ever been. They were selling millions of records, and the actual Empire record is fantastic. It's musically pretty much in the same style as the preceding album, Operation Mindcrime, only that it doesn't have any concept. Best I Can is a great opener. The Thin Line is like this artistic prog song. Jet City Woman and Another Rainy Nights are 2 big hits from the album, and I think that Hand on Heart should have been the 3rd one. All tracks are fantastic. Delta Brown is this long 7 minutes proggy track. I really love the groove and the bass. Then Empire is a really badass track. Resistance sounds like something from Rage for Order album. Then there's a beautiful ballad, Silent Lucidity, which showcased Geoff Tate's bass voice. He's actually bass, and he's able to sing very low, so that was pretty impressive. And the closing track of the album, Anybody Listening, is another epic 7 minutes long track. Yeah, this album is pretty much perfect from start to finish. So, if you are a Queensryche fan, you know which 2 records are left, and it was very difficult for me to decide which one to put on number 2 and number 1. Both of them are masterpieces. So, at number 2 I have Rage for Order from 1986. This album is phenomenal. It is almost like a sci-fi prog metal album. You've got songs like Screaming in Digital, I See in Infrared, and you know, stuff like that. So it gives a very sci-fi image. And I would say, I would go as far as to call this album a first prog metal album. I mean, without this record we wouldn't have had bands like Dream Theater or Threshold or, you know, Haken and so on. And this sounds a lot like their debut album, but like advanced version of it. Walk in the Shadows is phenomenal. I Dream in Infrared is another classic. The Killing Words has this beautiful atmosphere and melody. Surgical Strike is this piercing metal track. Chemical Youth is pretty much a metal anthem. London is another great track. You know, I could go on and on about every track from this album, but it really is perfect from start to finish, and every time I revisit this record I'm looking forward to it. So, and number 1, Operation Mindcrime from 1988. This is considered to be one of the best concept albums of all times. I would probably go as far as to say it's the best one. I love this record. This was the first album I heard from Queensryche back when I was like 17, so that's like 10 years ago, a bit more. And everything is perfect. The storytelling, the atmosphere, the melodies. It really is that sort of a thriller story about deception, murder, and drugs, and it's just amazing, you know, all those sounds, and it really feels like you're watching a movie, only that it's not a movie but a phenomenal prog metal album. I wouldn't even say there are favorite tracks on this album because every song is perfect. I mean, Revolution Calling is so great, I Don't Believe in Love is a great hit, Suit Sister Mary is grandiose, it really is. So how did you like my list? If you're a Queensryche fan, you can let me know in the comment section below what is your own list of Queensryche records going from worst to best. If you like this video, don't forget to like, to share. You can follow me on Facebook or on Instagram. You can find the links to both in the description of this video below. Don't forget to subscribe, to check out my own original music, my live performances, and my other worst to best videos. Plus I have a lot of reviews on the channel as well. So thanks a lot for watching.